How did I get inspired by this prototype photo to start modeling an HO scale flat car with an oversized load? And how did I come to want to weather it like the prototype? That's something that we'll be touching on in this video on how I weathered the flat car deck. You get this rusty pattern onto the deck of this Exactrail flat car. First started with a wash of the Tamiya panel line wash. I take a cosmetic wedge, and as you can see, I use about a corner of that because of the squared edge, and I lightly dab on some weathering powder that is a combination of several different Bragdon weathering powder. I dab it onto the corner of the cosmetic wedge here. We're going to use the panel wash as our base because it leaves it a little bit sticky. We're going to take this cosmetic wedge and just gently tap it. You might have to reload the wedge and just apply that powder into a random pattern on your flat car deck. It's okay that there's a little bit of a variance in the color because that can all be blended in later and it'll appear as random rust spots. One thing that I did here is I've already gone over it to get the initial base and make sure that it's kind of the shade and tone that I'm after. And I'll go in and do the depressed center section next. And I'll follow it up on the other end where all the equipment is because I want to weather some of the brake equipment as well during this process because the prototype image doesn't have a whole lot of rust on that yellow. It's mostly just a fade. I've loaded up my cosmetic wedge here and I'm just going to go along and just keep going on that deck. There's a little bit of panel wash that is still inside the holes on the deck, and that's okay because as you can see it comes up and it kind of wicks that panel wash up, and that'll leave some darker stains once that evaporates. So we'll just keep going along here. I try to use the same corner because it will hold more of that powder and some of that extra wash for a little bit longer than if you start with a new one. You might have to end up working it in. Now we've got this kind of a line here where you can see where it's just the washed area and you can see where the powder has been applied. I'm going to keep going across that, just loading up the cosmetic wedge as needed. If you apply it a little too heavy and you really don't like the look of it when it's done on this step, you can go back with a stiff bristled dry brush and you can kind of almost strip it off, and it ends up leaving a little bit of like a chipped and a flaky like look to it. Some of this Bragdon powder that I've mixed up is some of the like the dark earth shades, the dark rust, and some medium rust. There's been a little bit of light rust that gets dropped in there on occasion from different projects that I work on. And that's not a bad thing because it does offer a little bit of that fresh surface rust that might start occurring if an area scraped away that top layer and it's starting to come back through again. One of the things to do is to use a paint, like a rust tone or a dark leather, perhaps deep brown, chocolate brown. Create the base layer with the paint instead of the wash. And I found that over the years, the paint, for me anyway, does not offer quite as much of a subtle layering effect. You kind of have to apply the paint in a more random application. Here's that little bit lighter rust that I was just mentioning that kind of finds its way in here. It's a nice effect that will give it a little bit more of a texture appearance, not so much an actual textured surface, but going over it and then layering the different shades on here can help. If we go in here on this section here that has this little patch that's of fresh rust, you can take the corner of the cosmetic wedge and we can just work in a circle, but it blends it out and it doesn't look like it's just a glob of powder that's on there. As I keep working this, everything still has a little bit of a shine that is here and even along the edges where the white is. The shine comes from that panel line since it's got a little bit of that oil to it. And what I keep doing is I keep going back over that surface until that initial layering of powders gets rid of that shine. If I can't quite see a shine when I look at it here with the different lighting, then I know I've gotten that first layer of powders down. Might have to go back through with a little bit of a brush and kind of open up some of those deck holes there. But for the most part, this is kind of the effect that wanting to go for. Back up here on the brake end of the car, and you can see that this is a lot lighter and that still has just the wash on it. I'm going to go through with that cosmetic wedge again and just get the initial layer of that powder on there. Gone through with the cosmetic wedge, and as you can see, it's pretty well loaded up. And I've gotten around a lot of this end. And with this end, the one thing I need to do is get underneath the brake lines. This is a car that I really don't want to disassemble that unless I have to. So one of the tools that you can use is you can use a brush that you like. This happens to be a number 10 from Royal and Langnickel that I pick up, and this is one of the brushes that I use pretty frequently during my weathering. It won't load up quite like the cosmetic wedge, but this longer bristle will allow you to get in underneath that detail and still apply it. You can use some stippling motions, you can use a dragging motion side to side, and that will still give you a similar effect. This brush will end up being the next step for the rest of the flat car deck, so everything will end up getting kind of blended in a little bit, similar to the way it looks like on this end of this car. So I've gotten this end of the car pretty well taken care of for the moment, until the next step when I seal it with some Tamiya TS80 flat clear. The next thing will be to do is to take care of the center section of the deck and then the other end of the deck over here. I'm going to use that same brush and load it up with some more of that powder. And I'm just going to go along, and you don't want to drag it. You want to stipple that powder on. Because the more that you drag it across your surface, you're going to create cleaner spots. And that may work if that is the specific effect you're going for in that spot on your car. But with a deck that is like this from the prototype, there's not too many clean spots on this flat car deck. So I'm kind of working in a controlled pattern that is seemingly random, and I just try to bounce back and forth so I don't keep creating the same color and shade of powder in the same areas. So I go along here. Don't be scared to use a lot of powder on this, because the majority of what goes through the deck you should be able to use in a later step by taking it off of a clean surface that you're working on. Pretty good with it on here for now. We'll clean that off and I'll go back up here. Set that down and grab my cosmetic wedge again, since this still is a little tacky, and I'm going to go back and forth. I'm just going to leave that so there's a little bit of a variation here. To finish this off, I'm going to come over on the other end of the flat car. I'm going to do that same technique by building up the powder. By kind of starting around the edges and then working it into, taking care that I don't muddy up the brake equipment too much. So the next part of this project is going to be to seal this as it is right now. Just need to wait a little bit longer on the two spots that are kind of dark from that wash yet. I used the Tamiya TS80 flat clear, and one of the things about that particular product is that it is a lacquer base clear, so whatever is on your surface, it's going to darken up slightly, maybe about a shade, depending on the type of powder that you used. Prototype, the white slopes of the flat car look like they were freshly repainted. So after going through here with all the powder and the wash, and I've created a little bit of an effect where the rust is starting to take over that white again. I'll probably leave that along the top, but I'm going to use a cotton swab and some 70% alcohol, and I'm going to slowly lighten up the slopes just a little bit, just to give it the appearance that it's a little bit whiter, more similar to the prototype. Be careful that you don't use too much alcohol, because that will run and it will actually start taking away a little bit of that rust powder that we've put down. May have to come back with a dry cotton swab in between just to take some of that off. I'm creating a little bit of a streaking effect because I'm pulling some of that rust powder up, and that's not a bad effect, but I'm going to have to be aware of that and work my way down. Natural course of weathering would be, so I want to work it in a more natural way. Now that I've gone over those slopes a few times and gotten that a little bit lighter, I've gotten rid of the surface grime. It created a little bit of a streaking effect toward the bottom where a lot of that grime and rust would prototypically accumulate. So I'm going to call that good for now. Before I seal it, I'm going to use a micro brush, and I'm going to lighten up the brake equipment here, the reservoir, the valve, and then the brake wheel stand, so it looks like it not only sun faded but also weathered kind of about the same time. For the fade, I'm going to use this Humbrol enamel. This is a matte finish paint, and it's number 99 on the lid here. I'm going to use my micro brush. This is I believe a regular size, and I'm going to use just a small amount of paint on the end of that micro brush. And I'm going to come over here and we'll zoom in on the brake end. I'm going to take that paint and I'm just going to ever so slightly stipple it onto the valve, and I'm going to run it across the top of the reservoir here. There's a little bit of weathering powder on here, and that'll be okay because that will also blend in slightly to create the effect that it's weathering and fading kind of at the same time. This paint, might not be able to see quite as much, is about 2 shades lighter than the original Exactrail TTX color. So this is going to work fairly well to create that faded look that I'm going for based off of the prototype image that I've found. I'm going to work it down the side, and I'm not going to worry too much about getting underneath because the grime from the flat car will work its way up from underneath. Using the stippling motion, I'm just going to slowly work it onto the detail parts here. And as I'm putting it on, I will occasionally load up the micro brush a little bit to make sure that I'm applying enough paint and I'm not just dragging around. I'm also working in a top-down fashion so that as you look at the car, the effect will be a little bit more natural than just, oh, it was painted to be faded. The Umbro paints tend to stay fluid for quite a while, and as they slowly dry, they become almost tacky, and that works in your favor on this type of a method because it's giving you the opportunity to very lightly apply another layer of lighter colored yellow on top of that. I'm going to finish up the brake wheel stand here. You can now kind of tell between the sides of the car here, it's a little bit in shadow, but how much lighter this equipment seems to be. It turned out okay. I'm going to let that paint cure before we add to the next step of sealing. Now that we've gotten the flat car deck sealed, I took some Tamiya XF1 and XF10. The XF1 is flat black and XF10 is flat brown. I'm putting a little bit, about a 2-to-1 ratio of that together. And with the cosmetic wedge, I'm dabbing that on to the cosmetic wedge, and then I'm going over the flat car deck, and this is creating some darker rust patches. And again, this is just a really, really random application. And just a little. You don't need to overdo this step. This is only an accent step. And it's really only to create a secondary layer of color and tone to this flat car. And this paint tends to get a little gummy, so when it starts to stick, you can apply it gently and create some actual surface texture. Using the paint on the end of the cosmetic wedge to just stipple a little bit darker shade with that 2-to-1 ratio of the flat black and flat brown mixture is just enough to create some random patterns of a different tone, and it just creates another depth of that weathering on that. I'm going to go through and I'm going to do the sides of the car. I'm also going to do the underside of the car for this project. One of the things that really pushed me to do this project is I have a large load that I got from Kevin Tully at Steel Mill Modelers. It's one of these flat car loads that he produces in 3D printed resin. They are phenomenal, and I will set that up here. So I had already gone through and painted and weathered the mine sheave cable rack or holder, Let me get that lined up here. And all I did with that was paint it a light steel gray, and then I washed it with the black Tamiya panel line wash here. We'll zoom in here, and I'll get the sheave wheel set in place. Now this isn't 100% completed, but this gives you an idea of kind of what the overall look of this car is going to be. My idea for this car is to make it appear as though that the cradle and the car are used frequently for this type of service, and then it's just the sheave wheel that gets removed and then sent back empty. So that's part of the reason why I kind of over-weathered that cradle, and I went and followed the prototype picture for the flat car. I'll probably end up detailing it with some straps similar to the picture where they have an eye bolt, or I may just drill and add an eye bolt for myself. We'll just have to see how it turns out. Hopefully someone is able to take away a little bit of the techniques and tips that I've offered in this about weathering, and you'll be able to apply those tips and tricks to one of your own projects somewhere down the line. Thanks for watching, and be back with another video soon.